Something strange is happening. Atheists are winning the argument. But not by debating, not by mocking religion, not by writing long manifestos. Most of them aren't even trying. And that's what should scare believers the most. Because when one side stops arguing and the other side keeps defending harder and harder, it usually means the battle was already decided. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Atheism isn't spreading because atheists are smarter, louder, or more aggressive. It's spreading because belief systems are collapsing under their own weight. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why the argument is being lost. Even in rooms where atheists never speak, the silence that changed everything. For a long time, belief systems survived on a single advantage that few people ever questioned: control of the conversation. The rules were simple and invisible. One side spoke with authority. The other listened with obedience. Priests explained reality. Teachers repeated it. Parents passed it down. And doubt stayed quiet, not because it lacked questions, but because it lacked permission. Questioning existed, but it whispered. It hid in the back of the mind. It waited until late at night, when no one was watching. To question out loud was to risk shame, punishment, or exile. Silence was not agreement. It was survival. That silence made belief feel stronger than it really was. But something changed, slowly at first, almost invisibly. The silence did not disappear. It moved. Today, atheists rarely interrupt sermons. They do not flood debates. They do not chase believers down hallways demanding answers. Most of them simply step back and watch, not with anger, not with mockery, with distance. They watch believers argue with science and lose credibility. They watch sacred texts collide with history and fracture. They watch denominations split, not over evidence, but over interpretation. And the most revealing part is this: none of it requires atheist intervention. The arguments happen internally now, belief systems questioning themselves in public, leaders contradicting leaders, faith fighting faith. And that is new. Because when someone stops defending themselves, it usually means they no longer feel under attack. They no longer feel the need to convince. They no longer feel the fear that once drove them to argue. Atheists did not go silent because they lost confidence. They went silent because they gained it. They realized something unsettling. Belief systems collapse faster when no enemy is visible. Without an external threat, attention turns inward. Cracks become harder to ignore. Doubt becomes personal rather than political. Silence becomes a mirror. And once people begin arguing with themselves, no opponent is needed. The unraveling starts quietly. It always does. Belief systems were built for a different world. Most belief systems were not designed to survive the world we live in now. They were engineered for a slower reality, a world without instant answers. A world where information moved at the speed of a horse, not a fiber optic cable. A world where authority did not expect to be questioned, because questioning was expensive, slow, and often dangerous. In that world, belief served a practical role. It filled the gaps of ignorance. When the stars were unreachable, they became divine. When illness was mysterious, it became moral. When lightning struck, it carried intention. Belief explained what could not be measured, tested, or seen. And for a long time, that worked. But today, the gaps that belief once occupied are disappearing, not gradually, rapidly. We can look into deep space and trace the birth of galaxies. We can scan the brain and watch thoughts form in real time. We can simulate entire universes on machines small enough to fit on a desk. Mystery did not vanish, but its territory shrank. Here is the problem belief systems now face. They were never designed to compete with evidence. They were designed to exist in its absence. Faith thrives where certainty cannot reach. But modern life is built on verification, on testing, on correction. Every claim now enters a hostile environment by default. It can be checked, compared, debunked, archived forever. And belief systems are struggling to adapt. Not because they are stupid, not because believers are naive, but because the structure itself assumes a world where authority speaks first and questions come last. Today, questions arrive instantly, publicly, and they never forget. Atheists did not dismantle faith brick by brick. They did not need to. Reality did the work quietly. Each new discovery did not directly attack belief, but it reduced the space where belief was necessary. And when a system depends on unexamined space to survive, shrinking that space is fatal. What makes this even harder is that belief systems cannot simply update like software. Their authority is rooted in timelessness, in claims of unchanging truth. Adapt too quickly, and credibility collapses. Adapt too slowly, and relevance disappears. So, the system freezes, caught between a past it cannot abandon and a present it cannot control. And in that tension, something subtle happens. People stop asking what they are allowed to believe, and start asking what still makes sense. Once that question becomes normal, the foundation begins to shift. Quietly, irreversibly. The burden of proof quietly shifted. There is a subtle psychological shift happening that most people never consciously notice, yet it changes everything. It does not look like an attack. It does not sound like a debate. It feels almost harmless. Atheists are not required to explain the universe. They are not asked to produce a flawless theory of existence. They are not burdened with cosmic certainty. They simply ask one question: how do you know? That question does something unsettling. It quietly transfers responsibility. Suddenly, the believer is no longer sharing a story. They are defending a claim. And once a belief becomes a claim about reality, it must survive scrutiny. From that moment on, the weight shifts. Believers must explain miracles that leave no physical trace. They must explain contradictions that stretch across centuries of scripture. They must explain why evil exists in a world governed by goodness, why suffering is allowed under omnipotence, why prayers go unanswered, why divine silence is indistinguishable from absence. Each explanation creates another question. Each answer demands a deeper defense. The structure begins to wobble under its own complexity. Atheists do not carry this burden. They do not claim to know why the universe exists. They do not promise meaning handed down from beyond reality. They are comfortable saying they do not know yet, or maybe we never will. That humility is often mistaken for weakness. In reality, it is strategic strength. Because certainty is heavy. It demands consistency across every domain of life: science, morality, history, personal experience. One crack forces reinforcement everywhere else. Belief systems promise certainty. That promise is their appeal. It is also their vulnerability. In debates, the side that claims certainty must protect every edge, every exception, every unanswered question. The side that admits uncertainty can retreat without collapsing. Over time, people notice this imbalance. They feel it intuitively. One side sounds increasingly defensive. The other sounds increasingly calm. And when calm replaces urgency, something powerful happens. The audience stops asking who is right and starts asking who feels more honest. Once that shift occurs, the argument is no longer about God or atheism. It becomes about credibility. And credibility does not belong to the side that claims to know everything. It belongs to the side that admits what it cannot know. That is how the burden of proof moved, quietly. And once it moved, it never came back. Morality didn't fall apart, and that was unexpected. For centuries, religion made a powerful prediction: remove God, and everything collapses. Morality would crumble, society would decay, humans, unrestrained, would turn on each other. It was not just a warning, it was a fear-based contract. Believe, or chaos follows. That claim worked because it felt intuitive. If morality comes from God, then removing God should remove morality. Simple, clean, terrifying. But then something unexpected happened. God faded from public life in many places. Not through revolution or violence, but through indifference. And the collapse never came. Look around the modern world. The most secular countries often report the lowest crime, the strongest social trust, the highest cooperation between strangers. People still help each other. They still care for the vulnerable. They still build systems that reduce suffering rather than amplify it. Kindness did not disappear, meaning did not evaporate, purpose did not die. And that created a quiet crisis for belief systems. Because when a system makes a prediction and reality contradicts it, the damage is not loud, it is internal. Doubt creeps in sideways. If this warning was wrong, what else might be wrong too? Believers were told morality required divine surveillance, that, without an all-seeing judge, humans would have no reason to behave. But what emerged instead was something more unsettling. Many people behave morally, even when no one is watching. Not because they fear punishment, but because empathy exists, because cooperation works, because shared suffering creates shared responsibility. Morality turned out to be older than doctrine, deeper than scripture, rooted in human psychology and social survival. And once people saw that goodness did not require belief, the emotional leverage weakened, fear lost its grip, the threat no longer worked. This was not supposed to happen. The warning was meant to be decisive, final. When it failed, it did more than disprove a claim. It undermined trust. Because if morality survives without God, then belief is no longer a necessity. It becomes a choice. And when belief becomes optional, people begin examining it rather than obeying it. That is the moment everything else comes back under review. The rules, the stories, the authority. One failed prediction does not destroy a belief system overnight, but it opens the door. And once that door is open, curiosity walks in. And curiosity never stops at just one question. Faith lost its emotional monopoly. For most of human history, religion held something far more powerful than arguments. It held emotional territory. When people suffered, faith offered comfort. When life felt meaningless, it offered purpose. When individuals felt alone, it offered belonging. These were not small things. They were existential needs. And religion was often the only place that claimed to meet them. That monopoly made belief resilient. Even when doctrines felt confusing or contradictory, the emotional payoff remained. Faith did not have to be proven. It had to be felt. But that landscape has changed. Today, suffering is no longer explained only through sin or divine testing. Psychology offers language for pain, trauma, grief, anxiety. People can name what they feel without invoking punishment or cosmic purpose. They can heal without confession. Meaning also escaped its enclosure. Philosophy asks questions religion once guarded. Why are we here? What makes a life worth living? How should we treat each other? These questions are now explored openly, without requiring submission to a sacred authority. And belonging followed the same path. Community no longer depends on shared doctrine. People find connection through values, interests, struggles, and goals. Support exists without ritual. Solidarity exists without belief. This is devastating for belief systems, not because they lost arguments, but because they lost leverage. When faith no longer controls comfort, hope, and identity, what remains is doctrine, rules, claims about reality, stories that must now stand on their own. And doctrine without emotional insulation is fragile. Once people realize they can feel human without belief, the fear dissolves. They no longer stay because leaving feels like emotional death. They leave because staying feels unnecessary. Religion still offers meaning to many, but it no longer owns meaning. It competes for it. And competition exposes weakness. Because when someone stays only for comfort, doubt can be tolerated. But when comfort exists elsewhere, doubt becomes decisive. At that point, belief must justify itself intellectually, not emotionally. And many belief systems were never built for that test. They were built to soothe, to reassure, to hold, not to compete in a world where people can find warmth without kneeling. Once faith loses its emotional monopoly, belief becomes optional. And optional beliefs must earn their place. Most do not. The strangest part, atheists don't need to convert you. One of the most misunderstood things about atheism is how little it asks of anyone. It does not knock on doors. It does not hand out pamphlets. It does not warn of eternal punishment or promise eternal reward. There is no hell to fear and no paradise to chase, no loyalty oath, no ritual of belonging. Atheism does not recruit, because it does not need to. It waits. That waiting is not passive. It is strategic in a way that feels almost invisible. It allows questions to mature instead of forcing answers too early. It allows doubt to grow without shame. It allows people to sit with uncertainty long enough for it to become familiar rather than frightening. This patience is powerful because belief systems depend on urgency. They rely on early commitment, on answers given before questions fully form, on emotional pressure applied before doubt has language. Atheism applies none of that pressure, and the result is counterintuitive. People do not feel pushed, they feel free, and freedom accelerates thinking. Beliefs that are imposed tend to collapse violently. Under confrontation, they harden. Under attack, they fracture. They break loudly, leaving resentment behind. But beliefs that are abandoned collapse quietly. They fade. They dissolve. One day, a person simply realizes they no longer believe what they once defended. Most atheists did not argue their way out of religion. They did not win debates or lose faith in a single moment. They followed questions, slowly, privately, thought by thought. That process is almost impossible to interrupt. You can challenge an argument. You can counter a claim. But you cannot stop someone from thinking when no one is watching. You cannot debate a doubt that has not been spoken. You cannot reverse a conclusion that arrived without pressure. This is why conversion efforts often fail in the long run. They address behavior, not belief. They silence questions rather than resolving them. Atheism does not need to convert you because it does not depend on numbers. It depends on time, and time favors questions. Once a person learns they are allowed to think without fear, no debate can bring the old certainty back. It does not feel like loss. It feels like clarity. And clarity does not argue. It settles. Believers are arguing the wrong enemy. There is a tragic irony playing out in public debates, sermons, and online arguments. Religious energy is still aimed in the same direction it always was. At atheists, at skeptics, at critics who openly challenge belief. Entire arguments are built to defeat disbelief, as if disbelief were an invading force. But atheists are not the real threat. They never were. The real pressure comes from something far quieter. Information, education, exposure. No one has to point out every contradiction anymore. People stumble into them on their own. A verse remembered from childhood collides with a historical timeline. A moral teaching clashes with lived experience. A confident sermon is followed by a quick search that tells a different story. No one announces the moment. There is no confrontation, just a pause. Every doubt that forms in silence matters more than 1,000 public debates. Every unanswered prayer lingers longer than a shouted rebuttal. Every moment where belief fails privately leaves a deeper mark than any external attack. Belief does not weaken when it is attacked. It weakens when it is observed. When people are no longer told what questions to ask, they start asking better ones. When they are no longer warned away from certain information, they explore it freely. Exposure does what argument cannot. It normalizes curiosity. This is why defensive responses feel increasingly frantic. Belief systems were trained to fight enemies with faces. Heretics, apostates, atheists with microphones. But information has no face. Education has no agenda. Exposure does not argue back. You cannot excommunicate a search result. You cannot shame a historical record. You cannot pray away a pattern that keeps repeating. And that makes this enemy impossible to confront directly. Religious institutions can debate atheists forever and feel victorious. But while they argue, people are quietly learning, quietly comparing, quietly noticing. The battlefield moved without announcement. The threat is not disbelief being shouted, it is belief being examined. And that is the hardest enemy to fight, because it does not fight back. It just shows. And once something is seen clearly, it cannot be unseen. Why this feels so unfair? To many believers, this entire situation feels deeply unfair. Not because they are losing arguments, but because the arguments themselves no longer matter. The rules changed without warning. The battlefield emptied, and the opponent walked away. Atheists are not standing at podiums demanding victory. They are not shouting rebuttals or chasing debates. They are not trying to humiliate belief in public. From the outside, it can look like apathy, like avoidance. But it is something far more unsettling. They simply stopped needing belief. And that is devastating to anyone still defending it. Belief systems are designed for confrontation, for persuasion, for winning souls. They assume the other side wants something they possess: meaning, certainty, comfort, salvation. But when someone no longer wants what is being offered, persuasion loses its power. Imagine arguing passionately for a door someone has already walked past. No matter how strong your case is, the urgency is gone. This creates a psychological imbalance. Believers feel obligated to defend what once felt self-evident. Atheists feel no obligation to attack what no longer feels necessary. One side is emotionally invested in preserving meaning. The other has already rebuilt it elsewhere. So the debate feels one-sided, not because one argument is stronger, but because one side is still playing and the other has left the table. That absence feels like disrespect, like a refusal to engage, like an unfair advantage. But it is none of those things. It is a shift in dependency. When belief is no longer required to function, to cope, to hope, or to live a moral life, defending it becomes optional, and optional defenses rarely survive long. There is no final debate, no clear winner, no dramatic collapse. Just a gradual realization. The argument did not end because atheists won. It ended because belief was no longer needed. And when need disappears, conflict dissolves. Not with applause, with silence. This isn't about atheists versus believers. It's about how belief systems survive or fail in an age of transparency. Atheism isn't rising because it offers better answers. It's rising because it's comfortable with unanswered questions. And that changes everything. The real victory isn't disbelief. It's intellectual freedom. The freedom to say, I don't know. And I'm okay with that. Because the moment certainty becomes optional, dogma loses its power. So whether you believe, doubt, or stand somewhere in between, keep questioning. Because truth doesn't fear curiosity. And if you value truth over comfort, stay curious. Subscribe.